everyone. My name is Christy, and I'm the manager of marketing and communications here at Rare. I'm so excited to welcome you all to our first installment of our new series, Rare Reads, in which we speak with a range of authors who are all writing engaging, thought-provoking, and solutions-oriented stories for our changing world. Today, we're welcoming Ben Goldfarb, an award-winning environmental journalist whose work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Atlantic, Science, The New York Times, Washington Post, National Geographic, Orion Magazine, and many others. His book, Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, was the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award recipient, and one of the first books ever featured in Rare's long-running Summer Reading List series. But of course, today we're going to be discussing Ben's latest book, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, which just a couple of weeks ago won the Sierra Club's 2024 Rachel Carson Award for Excellence in Environmental Writing. It's also been named one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Smithsonian, Science News, and Kirkus Reviews. Welcome, Ben, to Rare Reads.
It's great to be here, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today. I so appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and I'll begin with a quick kind of presentation about this book and about this topic before we launch into conversation and Q&A. So this book, Crossings, that we're talking about today is about road ecology, and road ecology is this relatively small but very fast-growing field of science that looks at all of the different ways that roads shape and transform nature. And roads are so transformative in large part because there are just so many of them, right? We have around 4 million miles of road here in the US, around 40 million miles of road around the world, and there was something like 15 million miles of paved road that will be built by mid-century. We're in the middle of this period that the ecologist Bill Lawrence has called the infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new construction that's sweeping our planet. And I think in part because roads are so ubiquitous, we don't really think about them very much, right? We use them every single day to go to schools and hospitals and grocery stores and trailheads, and we ignore them to some extent. And when we do think about them, we think about them in fundamentally positive terms, right? Roads are really useful, and especially in the U.S., there are some very powerful cultural connotations of roads. They're celebrated as these symbols of freedom and movement and mobility and momentum. Writers and artists like Jack Kerouac and Bruce Springsteen, my favorite guys, extol the kind of the virtues of the open road, which is somewhat ironic, of course, because everything they provide to us as human beings, they deny wild animals, right? They prevent animals from moving around the landscape at a truly mind-boggling scale. And the most kind of conspicuous, direct way that they curtail animal movement is roadkill, right? More than 1 million vertebrate animals, so to say nothing of insects and arachnids, are killed every day by cars in the United States alone. And I think in part because a lot of the species we tend to see on the roadside are logically enough the common ones, right? The white-tailed deer, the raccoons, the gray squirrels. I think that we have this perception, perhaps subconsciously, that roadkill, yes, it's killing lots of individual animals, but it's not necessarily a significant conservation crisis, right? Because again, the animals that are being killed in large numbers are, probability dictates the common ones. But in fact, there are dozens of federally threatened and endangered species in the US, from Florida panthers to ocelots to tiger salamanders, for which roadkill is one of, if not the primary causes of mortality, right? So roadkill is truly a conservation crisis on a really massive scale. And as Richard Foreman, one of the pioneers of road ecology, has pointed out, traffic is the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality on land around the planet, which is kind of a fancy scientific way of saying there is literally nothing that we do that kills more wild animals than drive. And I think that one of the reasons that roadkill is such a common and pernicious conservation issue is this really tragic way it has of subverting evolution, right? You think about the defense mechanisms of so many common species, and they're basically these stand your ground, hunker down defense mechanisms, right? Turtles withdraw into shells, and skunks spray, and porcupines bristle their quills. These are really effective strategies against cougars and wolves and other natural predators that have worked really well for thousands of generations. But when your predator is an F-150 barreling down I-70 at 80 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is withdraw into your shell and stand your ground, right? So roadkill and traffic has this way of taking evolutionary history and rendering it not only moot but maladaptive, and I find that really sad to contemplate. And of course, these collisions between wild animals and vehicles. Yes, they're this enormous conservation crisis, but they're not only dangerous for wild animals; they're also problematic for us as humans. As I think, unbeknownst to most people, the white-tailed deer, not snakes or sharks or bees. White-tailed deer are the single most dangerous wild animal in North America. And of course, it's not the deer's fault, right? It's the car's fault. But I think that just speaks to how common these deer vehicle collisions in particular really are. There are around 2 million or up to 2 million deer collisions in the US every year. So that's one about 30 seconds or every 30 seconds or so. The average deer collision costs society more than $9,000 in hospital bills and vehicle repairs and insurance costs and so on. So these are really expensive events as well as being very common events. And in fact, more than 400 drivers are killed in deer collisions every year. And that's I think a dramatic underestimate. Lots of single car crashes occur when people veer to avoid deer or elk or moose and hit a tree or a telephone pole. And so those 400 or so documented driver deaths are certainly on the low end. But for wild animals, the collision itself, that moment of impact between car and creature, is really only half the problem, right? And I was saying, moments ago that roads and traffic curtail animal movement and mobility and migration, and they do that not only by killing directly, but by actually impeding the movements of animals, right? You can imagine, a busy freeway like I-70 or 80 or 90, that constant wall of traffic that rolls down those roads is a huge deterrent to animals even attempting to cross highways, right? In fact, scientists have called that phenomenon, that wall of traffic, the moving fence. And in some cases, I think that moving fence that prevents animal migration can be almost more lethal than roadkill itself. And here's one example of that. So one chapter of this book deals with ungulate migrations, mule deer and elk and pronghorn in Wyoming. And there's this very famous herd of mule deer who winter in the Red Desert near Rock Springs, and they travel around 300 miles round trip between winter and summer range. And for many years, scientists have had satellite collars on those animals, so they kind of know where they go. And they've, assembled some really disturbing maps of mule deer migration. So here's, one of those disturbing maps. So these kinds of purple blobs here, right? This is, where those mule deer hang out in winter. And then this white line across the bottom of the screen is I-80, right? The big, busy interstate highway that cuts across their range. And as you can see, those deer basically never make it south of I-80. And that's a problem because a lot of the really good winter range is south of that highway. Historically, those deer might have gone as far south as Colorado, where I live. But today, their winter range is just cut off by that interstate. And as a result of that, in some especially harsh winters, 40% of that deer herd can actually starve. right? And again, that might be a bigger problem than roadkill itself. A herd of hundreds of deer, they can handle a few collisions on the highway. What they can't handle is losing access to all of that prime winter habitat. Here's another map that illustrates, kind of a similar concept. These are the movements of a single young male grizzly bear in Montana, and the white line is I-90. And every single red X is a point where that bear approached the highway and bounced off like a ping pong ball, repelled by that constant moving fence of traffic. And this bear attempted more than 40 crossings of this highway over the course of many months before he finally found a way across, right? So, again, that highway might be 150 feet from shoulder to shoulder, and yet it's denying wildlife access to millions of acres of habitat in some cases. Here's another really sad map. This is a map of mountain lion locations in Southern California. Very famous population of mountain lions that lives just west of Los Angeles in the Santa Monica Mountains. And every single sort of cluster of different multicolored dots are the movements or the locations of a single collared mountain lion. And what you can see very clearly is that those cats basically never cross those red lines, the freeways, right? The 101, the 405, some of the busiest freeways on Earth are an absolute barrier to mountain lion movement. And that's a problem because these mountain lions in the Santa Monicas are basically trapped, in this little island of habitat surrounded by this ocean of freeway. And as a result, they're stuck mating with their own daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters, right? No new mountain lions can disperse into the population. So they've become chronically inbred and they've entered what scientists have called an extinction vortex, right? This long-term doom spiral caused by this lack of genetic connectivity. So they're going to go extinct if nothing if nothing is done for them. But thankfully, something is being done for them, right? There's a massive wildlife overpass at Liberty Canyon, a very famous site in Southern California that's going to connect those mountain lions with cats elsewhere in California and allow that kind of genetic interchange that those animals need to survive. And this technique of building wildlife overpasses and underpasses and other structures that allow animals to move safely back and forth across highways is really the best tool in our toolbox for solving these two linked problems, right? Of wildlife vehicle collisions and a loss of habitat connectivity caused by road-induced fragmentation. So this idea of constructing wildlife crossings really begins in Europe. In the 1950s, France built the first wildlife crossings, followed by Germany and Switzerland and Austria and other Western European countries. Today, the world's leader in the technology is probably the Netherlands. Of course, the Dutch are just famously great engineers. Here's a kilometer-long Dutch overpass that crosses two highways, a railroad track, a sports complex, and a business park. Right, so a pretty cool structure. Wildlife crossings really become famous in the 1980s and 90s in Banff National Park in Canada, which has the Trans-Canada Highway running right through the middle of it. And there, Parks Canada built around 40 wildlife crossings, including a half dozen overpasses, primarily for grizzly bears, which were indeed successful in allowing bears to move back and forth across the Trans-Canada Highway, mate on either side. Sows and cubs went back and forth. Sows taught their cubs how to cross, their cubs became crossers. And so there's kind of this cool intergenerational exchange of knowledge within that bear population. And that was very well documented by scientists. So Banff National Park is, probably the most influential site in the history of wildlife crossings. Here in the US, the first crossings were built in the 1970s in states like Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, states with large migratory ungulate populations. And the reason for that is that, those big herds of deer and elk and antelope, those tend to be fairly easy animals to mitigate for, right? You can imagine if 1,000 mule deer cross a highway in Wyoming in the same place every single year, Well, there's this big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put a wildlife crossing right here, right? And so it's fairly easy to know where to put those structures. One of the really important lessons that road ecologists learned early on is the importance of fencing, right? People always say, how do the animals know to use the crossings? And the answer is the fences basically guide them, right? Those deer are trying to cross the highway, they hit that fence line, they, pace the fence line for a quarter mile, and then there's the underpass or overpass beckoning to them and guiding them through. So those two structures, the crossings and the fences, really work extremely well hand in hand. Another important lesson that road ecologists have picked up on is just the importance of providing animals a diversity of crossing opportunities. Right? We can, imagine that just as every animal has its own ecological niche, it has its own crossing niche. Some like to go over, like grizzly bears. Some are happy going under, like coyotes and bobcats and a lot of more generalist carnivores. Right? So providing different opportunities for all those different critters is really important. So here's one example of that. There's a very cool, famous network of wildlife crossings on I-90 up in Snoqualmie Pass in Washington, just outside of Seattle. And there they've got an overpass, which is primarily for elk. Elk are generally overcrossers. But what you can see here is that they've got all of these cool log structures kind of bolted into place on that overpass, and those logs get used by lizards and snakes and toads and rodents and mustelids and all of the kind of the smaller critters who need that cover to cross the overpass. They've also got these kind of big, beautiful, very capacious underpasses. You can see they actually separated the lanes of traffic to allow light to reach that underpass floor to create a more naturalistic environment. And here, it's just what you can sort of see in the background is there's this line of rocks that runs through that underpass, and that line of rocks is this good, rocky substrate. Not only for reptiles, but also for pikas, which live up there on Snoqualmie Pass as well. So again, just thinking about that whole community. And they've got, some enlarged culverts. Culvert are basically these pipes, right, that funnel streams and wetlands and other water features under highways. And, by building these larger, more inviting culverts rather than, narrow corrugated pipes, you can provide crossing opportunities for not only fish and amphibians, but also, semi-aquatic mammals like otters and beavers and mink, right? So again, just thinking about all of those different animals and tailoring crossing opportunities to each of them, I think is, really interesting and important and exciting. So probably the most common objection to wildlife crossings that you still hear in some quarters is, look, these structures are kind of expensive, right? Or at least they seem expensive. These days the typical overpass is going to run you, $5 to $10 million. Underpasses, generally start at $500,000, right? So there's a little bit of sticker shock there. But to that objection, I say two things. First of all, in the context of vast transportation and infrastructure budgets, a few $1,000,000 for a wildlife crossing is, barely a drop in the bucket. But also, wildlife crossings have this wonderful way of paying for themselves, right? We established earlier that wildlife vehicle collisions are these really dangerous, expensive events. And if you can build structures that prevent dozens of them a year, as many wildlife crossings do, those structures can pay for themselves very quickly, right? So here's an example of that. This is an overpass in Wyoming that was built for mule deer and pronghorn migration, and there was lots of hand wringing when it was proposed. We're really going to spend millions of dollars helping antelope cross a highway, but this structure actually paid for itself in under 5 years through crash prevention, right? So wildlife crossings, yes, they're good conservation policy, but they're also good fiscal policy. And I think that's a big part of why these structures are really catching on globally. That's one of the exciting findings in my book. I think is just how international this movement has really become. I visited Brazil, where wildlife crossings are being built for giant anteaters and capybaras and tapirs. In Nepal, there are actually laws requiring new wildlife crossings with any construction in forested areas, which is much more progressive than any wildlife crossing legislation we have in the U.S. And some of the coolest projects out there are in India. Where they're building new highways that in some cases are actually elevated on concrete pillars for many miles. So instead of having isolated wildlife underpasses, the entire forest floor is open to permit tigers and elephants and other animals to wander back and forth safely, right? So some of the best, most creative examples of innovation are occurring not in North America and Western Europe, but in the quote unquote developing world, where countries are building out their infrastructure now and doing it more thoughtfully and creatively than we certainly managed in the US. So I wanted to close by sort of offering a prompt. One of the places that got me really excited about wildlife crossings more than a decade ago was Highway 93 north of Missoula, on the Flathead Reservation, the land of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, which in the early 2000s basically forced the state of Montana and the U.S. Department of Transportation to build more than 40 wildlife crossings along the highway as it ran through their land. And the really wonderful sentiment that the tribes expressed at that time was that the road was meant to be a visitor to their land rather than a conqueror of it, and should respond to and respect the spirit of place. And I find that to be a really powerful, provocative idea. What does it mean for a road to be a visitor to the landscape? Again, given just how ubiquitous these structures are and how much they change their surroundings. So with that, I wanted to say thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions and to talking more with Christy. I will briefly say that this book received various sort of plaudits from from places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, right? So liberals and conservatives uniting around the niche cause of road ecology and wildlife crossings. And I said that somewhat facetiously, but I think that's one of the really wonderful things about this issue, is that it's truly nonpartisan. Nobody wants to hit a deer or an elk. This is one of the only environmental issues, I think, in our incredibly polarized society that is equally supported by the hunting lobby and the Humane Society. And in fact, a recent opinion poll found that 85% of Coloradans, where I live, support more wildlife crossings. So this is truly a nonpartisan issue that we can all work on in our own way. And I'm looking forward to talking about it with all of you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ben. I have to say, I love that you ended on closing on Highway 93. So I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University, and we actually just went on a reporting trip out to Montana, where we met with members of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and we did an actual driving tour of Highway 93 to see all of these road and highway crossings. It was incredible to watch, and we learned so much being there. And that was a very random by chance thing that we did. And I just got back from that trip about a week and a half ago.
That's so cool. I'm so glad you had that experience. That's awesome.
I know, it was really cool. And I was like, oh, well, this is kind of perfect. So that was an incredible presentation. I absolutely loved the book, and I have so many questions buzzing around in my head. But I really want to start by asking you about how you choose which topics you're going to cover in books like this. So before Crossings, it was all about beavers, a really unsung hero of the American landscape. And as you mentioned in your presentation, roads are ubiquitous to the point of we're kind of ignoring them and we don't think about them. So I was just sort of curious, what do you look for when deciding on a subject to cover, and what is it that sparks your interest?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I wish I had a kind of a better, more precise answer. But I think look, as a journalist, right, I write for magazines and newspapers and websites, and so I'm always kind of interrogating those article ideas for book potential, and that's really where both of my books began, was with magazine stories, both for the magazine High Country News, which covers environmental issues throughout the American West, and with the road ecology stuff. I mean, that really began on Highway 93 in 2013. I had a chance to take a tour of those crossings, as you did, Christy, and the tour ended I was hanging out with this guy named Marcel Hauser, who's a very famous road ecologist. And Marcel took me at the end of the day on this tour of the overpass, that goes over Highway 93, in the town of Arley, on the Flathead Reservation, and it was just an incredibly powerful, inspiring moment on a couple of levels. First, we do so much on this planet to make wild animals' lives harder and more difficult and dangerous. And here was this, multi-million-dollar piece of infrastructure that we built to make their lives easier and safer, and so that idea that infrastructure could be this form of ecological compassion or empathy towards wild animals, I found that to be incredibly powerful. And then there's also the intellectual challenge of it too. How do you create a built structure that's enticing to a grizzly bear or a moose or a mink or a meadow vole, the whole suite of animals that are out there, they all have their own crossing requirements. And, how do you appeal to all of them? How do you create human built infrastructure for wild users? That just seemed like an incredibly fascinating topic. And so, I think that anytime you end an article as a journalist and still have many more questions, that's a good sign that there might be some book potential there.
Yeah, that's great. And just even going off of that idea, like you use road ecology and this exploration of roads as a way to really interrogate our meaning humans impact on the planet. And I was really struck by a quote that you have in the book on page 96 by E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, who kind of took the idea of the Anthropocene one step further and called it, and I might pronounce this wrong, but the Eremocene, or the age of loneliness. And you describe it as the near and desolate future in which humankind bestrides an empty world, or perhaps drives over it. So in your opinion, because you are a writer and you are a storyteller, what role does storytelling have in helping us create a better future and envisioning a better future and then working towards it?
Yeah. I used the phrase ecological empathy earlier, and I feel like that's a really good place to begin the storytelling conversation in a lot of ways, right? I think that for a long time, scientists and science writers were afraid of anthropomorphizing wild animals, right? We didn't want to ascribe human characteristics to wild creatures, but I think in some ways that has the inadvertent effect of diminishing those animals in some ways, right? The famous and recently deceased primatologist Frans de Waal talked about the kind of the inverse of anthropomorphism, which is anthropodenial, right? The idea that we deny other animals the ability to have complex thoughts and cognition and experience emotions and be loving towards their kin, and all of the wonderful attributes that we ascribe to ourselves. We deny wild animals those capacities and abilities, and so I think that a big part of changing our infrastructure in some ways is actually inhabiting those animal standpoints, and so in this book I tell lots of stories about individual animals, like P22, of course, the most famous, mountain lion in the world, who really helped to inspire that overpass that's being built in Southern California, or, Evelyn, the giant anteater, this incredible study subject I met in Brazil, who was helping scientists understand the impacts of, Brazil's new highways on giant anteaters and other species, right? And I think that just look, acknowledging that we can't fully understand what it's like to be those non-human organisms, I think it's nonetheless important to try to imagine it and to think about what their lives are like, because I do think that there are lots of really good human-centered arguments for changing our infrastructure, right? Like wildlife vehicle collision avoidance, that there are good human safety and fiscal arguments for that, and I make those arguments in the book as well. But I think that that kind of empathy for our non-human fellow travelers on this planet, I think that storytelling is kind of where that starts.
Yeah. And just what you just said in that answer really reminded me of something that we do at Rare in the countries that and the communities that we work in. One of the ways that we get people to inspire their communities to make changes for nature and for different species that might be impacted by human activity is by having the community choose a mascot, which is usually in the form of an endangered species in the area. And when I was reading the book, everything about P22 and Evelyn, it really kind of struck me. And that's like a tie to behavior change, right? Like we change our behaviors when we can empathize with an animal, whatever it is. So that's a really interesting tie-in, I think, to the work that we do. And then the other thought that I had on that was you mentioned in the book on page 100, few people had ever totaled their truck by running over a garter snake. Transportation agencies had largely ignored animals that didn't endanger drivers, which I don't really have a question connected to that, just like a really interesting thought about, when we're constructing these new or if we're thinking about different ways to construct roads that are really helpful to different animals, how do we remember to keep, those smaller invertebrates, top of mind as well?
Yeah, I do think that we need to shift our perspective to some extent about what wildlife crossings are for, or at least, imagine additional wildlife crossings, right? Most of the wildlife mitigation we've done in the U.S. has been aimed at those larger common animals, deer, elk, moose, the critters that mess you up when you hit them, right? Because transportation agencies, I think understandably, right, this is kind of their job. They have this focus on, getting drivers safely from point A to point B, and deer might be an issue there, but garter snakes and wood frogs aren't really a driver safety concern, right? And so as a result, we haven't done a whole lot for those smaller animals, which is problematic because those critters are some of the most road threatened species on Earth, right? I mean, those amphibians especially, which are migrating in huge numbers on those warm, wet spring nights to their breeding ponds, and are crossing roads en masse, and have no conception of what a car is. There are so many populations of reptiles and amphibians that we've lost because of roadkill, and there are a few isolated examples of turtle tunnels and salamander passages out there, but we certainly haven't built them nearly as often as we should, nor nearly as often as as European countries have, for that matter. So yes, we certainly need many more deer and elk passages. That's great. We should be doing that, but we should also be thinking about those smaller, rarer species that aren't driver safety threats, but are certainly species of conservation concern.
Yeah, yeah. And that was such an eye-opening part of the book where I don't have the page number in front of me, but you talk about how, we're always thinking about deer, we're thinking about grizzly bears, but really there's this whole other section of the animal population that really needs our attention. And I think that kind of segues really well into the poll that we had at the beginning of, oh, there it is, at the beginning of this webinar. And the question is approximately how many animals are struck by cars on American roadways each day. And Ben answered that in his presentation. The answer is 1 million animals, but it's actually that's just vertebra animals, not invertebrates. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's an astounding number. And you also talked about, like, you kind of took us on a little tour. Oh, and only 21% of people got that right. Everybody else said either 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000. So it's actually 1 million, but potentially even more. Oh, I'm sorry. So in the book, you take us sort of across the world to different areas that are building these roadways or animal crossings. And I kind of want to take a quick stop in Tasmania, which we didn't get to in the presentation, which is great because Tasmania, as you write, is the roadkill capital of the world. And you write on page 224 that to many Tasmanians, roadkill is anesthetizing, a problem so prevalent that it no longer looks like a problem. So I was kind of curious to ask you, in all of your research, what did you see as one of the most effective ways to help people break out of this curse of numbness when we're seeing roadkill? Because there are a lot of people that are helping in your book.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny that you mentioned Tasmania because yes, it is this place where roadkill is so common that it can be anesthetizing, but there are also, hundreds, if not thousands, of people who actually, go out of their way to help animals affected by roads there, right? In Tasmania, of course, the animals tend to be marsupials, which means, unfortunately, that sometimes the female wallaby or wombat or possum will be hit by a car and her joeys will actually survive in that maternal pouch. And so there are hundreds of people who have taken it upon themselves to actually peruse the countryside, looking for those orphan joeys and actually extracting them from the pouch of female marsupials, which is, a little bit grisly, obviously, but I think also an incredible expression of compassion and attention, to the victims that the road creates. So that Tasmania chapter. Yes, it's about the anesthetizing quality of roadkill, but it's also about the people who actually seek roadkill out and pay attention to it, which I think is something we could learn a lot from here in the U.S. I think that one of the really pernicious things about roadkill and roads in general is that speed and cars both obliterate animals and blind us to them, right? And I think that's why that 1 million animals a day figure is so hard to grasp because we don't really see a lot of those animals, right? Yes, we see the deer and the raccoons and the possums and some of the bigger critters, but we don't see the amphibians, the snakes, the songbirds. I mean, hundreds of millions of songbirds being killed by cars every year, and those little animals, you just don't notice them when you're racing along at 70 miles an hour, sealed in your little metal and glass bubble, right? And so that's again, the road just kills animals, and then it hides them from us in a sense with velocity and height. And so one of the really powerful experiences that I had working on this book was actually biking along a major American highway, doing roadkill surveys that way, and just noticing. I mean, all of the birds, especially, really heartbreaking. And these are animals that you would just never see, in your in my case, a Subaru Crosstrek, right? So getting out on highways, I think on foot or on bicycle, and just moving at a slower, more human speed closer to the ground. I think that's just a really powerful way of understanding the violence of roads in a new sense.
Yeah, and that power of observation is so it's so crucial. Um, yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so we're gonna move into a really quick lightning round. Because I am really curious to know. So I just have a couple questions here. The first one is, what book is currently on your nightstand?
Yeah, well, I just finished this one. Actually, I read it as kind of a proof, a year ago or something, but now I'm rereading it in hardcover. But this is my friend Ferris Jaber's book, Becoming Earth: How Our Planet Came to Life, which is basically about the idea of Earth as a living system or even organism, insofar as biological life changes our geology, our climate, our oceans, and so on. And the idea that Earth is not just some hunk of rock; it's actually inextricable from the life that inhabits it. So it's a really beautiful book, and I recommend it highly.
Awesome. That is also on my to be read list.
Oh, good.
Um, what is your favorite? And I'm gonna say you can't use beaver. What is your favorite unsung species?
I don't know how unsung they are, but I'm a really just a great lover of fish in general, and I especially love, yeah, Western native trout, and these are fish that have really been squeezed out by invasive species and climate change and dams and all kinds of forces. But greenback cutthroat trout, Rio Grande cutthroat trout, those kind of rarer native trout in Colorado and other Western states. I'm just a big fan of those guys. I think they're such beautiful animals.
Very cool. And if you can say, you've covered beavers and roadkill. What's next for Ben Goldfarb?
Um, yeah, yeah. I'm writing a book about fish. That my cutthroat trout answer was my segue. But the book is sort of about all of the ways in which fish have shaped our planet and our human communities and cultures. All of the forces that are sort of eliminating them, especially migratory fish. We've lost something like 81% of our migratory freshwater fish on this planet, and what we can do to revive those incredibly important, beautiful, precious populations of aquatic creatures. So anybody who's working in the fish space and listening to this webinar, please reach out. I'd love to hear your fish restoration stories.
I'm sure that we have at least a few people in the audience that can respond to that, as fish and oceans are a really big part of Rare's work. So it's very exciting for us and our audiences. So before we move into a few audience questions, I have a few quick announcements. So first of all, thank you everyone for signing up for this Rare Reads book club. You're all members now, which is great, and you'll be the first to receive new book recommendations from Rare and future author talks in your email that you provided. In the meantime, you can check out rare.org/rare-reads to see our past summer reading lists and catch up on some of our old favorite books that we've listed in the past. So we've talked a little bit with Ben today about how individuals can make changes in the environment and just being aware of our impact. If you'd like to learn more about Rare's research and resources on behavior change for the environment, you can check out behavior.rare.org. And finally, if you have not yet had a chance to read Crossings or Eager, I highly recommend you do so. You can find links to purchase either of these books on Ben's website, which is bengoldfarb.com. And we will add all of those links into the chat for you. All right, so let's see. We'll move on to audience questions. Thank you for everyone who submitted any questions in advance. We pulled a few to start with. So our first question is, what can your average person do to mitigate the adverse effects on wildlife while we're using roadways?
Yeah, I'd say a few things about that. I mean, look, first, certainly you can be a more conscientious driver. I try to minimize my driving at night, especially, which is a really important period for animal movement. But I also want to be realistic about the solutions, right? Because ultimately we live in this incredibly automotive society, and if our goal is to sort of badger Americans into driving less and more slowly, that's probably a non-starter with a lot of people, right? And I've driven thousands of miles in the last year promoting my book about the ills of driving, right? I know that we live in this incredibly automotive society, and I think that ultimately the solution to these problems is not necessarily individual behavioral change. It's changing our infrastructure, right? Just as we're not going to necessarily solve climate change by hectoring people into changing their light bulbs, even if that's a good place to start, right? So fortunately, what's nice about this issue is that as I said earlier, it truly is nonpartisan, right? And there are so many examples of stories, many of which are in the book, of communities that basically documented this problem of roadkill in their communities, took it to, a county commission or a state legislator, or a local transportation department professional, and basically said, hey, here's this problem, we've documented it, what do we do? And unfortunately, it's a really exciting time to be doing that sort of community-led work. There's just so much funding for wildlife crossings now at the state and federal level. There's some private pots of money out there. So many environmental groups are interested in this issue. So I think that's, to me, this is an issue where doing the the good citizen thing, writing letters to your elected officials, really, it does make a difference. And there are so many examples of places where it has made a difference. So I'd just encourage you to be a good citizen of our democracy, and get involved as an advocate, as well as, sort of being a more conscientious driver.
Yeah, that's great. And it reminds me of another quote from the book, where you say the chief irony of biological annihilation is that we're both its cause and its solution. And so there really is a role that people can play. We have another question. Do you think the biodiversity loss will lead departments of transportation to consider roadsides a priority for native plants? I know you talk a little bit about this in the book.
Yeah, there's a chapter in this book because about that in the book, because as that question alludes to, roadsides are habitats in a sense, right? And in the American West, we're graced with huge amounts of public land, but that's not the case in Iowa and Illinois and other Midwestern states, where actually roadsides are the single largest form of public land, right? And so there's a great opportunity there, and many transportation departments have adopted sort of more progressive pro-habitat forms of roadside management that don't involve as much herbicide spraying and mowing as used to be kind of standard. And it has become good habitat, or at least habitat for monarch butterflies and rusty patch bumblebees and all kinds of pollinators who use that native vegetation along roadsides. But that's also a dangerous situation, right? There's always this risk of creating an ecological trap, drawing those animals into road corridors that then eliminate them, right? And in fact, millions of monarch butterflies become roadkill every year during their migration. We don't think about butterflies as being roadkill, but I think that ultimately the opportunity of roadside habitat is too great to ignore, but we also have to be thoughtful about how we plant and manage those habitats to avoid that ecological trap effect.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to another question that we have about departments of transportation and their role to play in all of this. Says, in your experience, in your research, what is the biggest barrier for state departments of transportation to ensure wildlife crossings are considered in new capital improvement projects?
I'd say that there are two barriers. There's a simple sort of knowledge and perspective barrier, right? As I said earlier, transportation departments, historically at least, have basically considered their job getting drivers safely from point A to point B, and whatever habitat fragmentation or ecological impact happens along the way, that's sort of like the state wildlife department's job, right? And that historically the transportation department and the wildlife department, in most states have not cooperated or collaborated as closely as probably they should. Fortunately, I think that dynamic is changing. I think that many more transportation engineers, view wildlife conservation as just part of their purview. So that's good. And then look, the second big barrier is just funding, right? And that's the case for every single conservation initiative on Earth, obviously. As I said earlier, there's more funding for wildlife crossings than there's ever been. The 2021 Infrastructure Act had a $350 million wildlife crossings pilot program, this big grant program that provided funding. That kind of induced many states to pass their own legislation allocating funding for this issue. So yes, there's more money out there for this issue than there's ever been, but it's still really a fraction of what we need. $350 million is basically enough to tackle right around every roadkill hotspot in California alone, with nothing left over for any other state, right? So, we're just scratching the surface, I think, in terms of the amount of funding that we should be allocating to this issue.
Yeah, and I'm gonna sort of jump to a question that I kind of have for you, but sort of relates to that. When you talk about Highway 93, and how the tribal nations were so pivotal in getting the state of Montana to build these wildlife crossings. Are there any lessons learned from that experience that the tribal communities had with the state of Montana and how they were able to push for that kind of change?
I think that one important lesson is that tribes are really powerful advocates for this work. I mean they have in many cases treaty rights. They have kind of the moral high ground in many instances. And I just did an article recently for High Country News about all of the tribes who are leading on wildlife crossing construction from from the Upper Skagit in Washington, to the Mescalero Apache in New Mexico. I mean, there are just so many cool examples popping up now of tribal-led habitat connectivity and wildlife crossing projects. And I'd encourage anybody interested in exploring this topic to I mean, work with the tribes who are already leaders on this issue. In Colorado, the Southern Ute a couple of years ago, worked with CDOT to build wildlife crossings on Highway 160 that have already been incredibly effective for deer and elk. So it's really exciting to see tribal leadership on this issue, and I think that empowering tribes to work on this topic is one of the most important things we can do.
Yeah, and going off of your answer to that question, we had just had a question come in. How cohesive are tribes in the United States in working with the government for funding, advice for wildlife crossings at the federal and state level? And then this person also added in Washington state tribes play a large role for U.S. Fish and USFS and state road upgrades to accommodate fish. And you do talk about that a little bit in the book as well. When you take us over to Washington State.
Yeah, there's a chapter of this book that's about the very famous Culverts case, right? Which was this legal case that rose all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, that basically this coalition of tribes in Western Washington sued the state of Washington, arguing that all of those crappy culverts, those little corrugated pipes under highways, were basically preventing salmon from migrating upstream and spawning and reproducing, and thus violating the tribe's fishing rights, which they've had, they've of course fished since time immemorial, but these treaties signed in the 1850s had basically guaranteed to the tribes the right, to harvest fish at all of their usual and accustomed places, and these culverts were preventing them from doing that and harming salmon populations, and were thus violating, tribal rights. And so, this case went to the Supreme Court. The tribes ultimately won, and now the state of Washington is in the very long, slow, expensive process of replacing hundreds of fish blocking culverts around the state. And to me, again, that's just a really powerful story, illustrating the legal and moral authority that Native tribes have. And I think to the person's question, is there sort of like a single centralized node of power? I mean, certainly there are there are Native sort of fish and wildlife groups that that do bring together knowledge sharing and information. But I think that most of these tribes are kind of operating on their own. But fortunately, that Wildlife Crossings pilot program, that big federal grant program, does list tribes as one of the eligible entities. And at least in the first round of funding, the Department of Transportation definitely prioritized those tribal applications, and to my knowledge, all of the tribes that applied for funding received it.
That's awesome. All right, we have time for one more question, and it's a question in two parts. So the first part is, what are some design ideas you have seen beyond adding crossings to help roads coexist better with the more than human world? I think that's how I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Is it feasible to have human hiking trails with wildlife crossings?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll take the second part of the question first. In Europe especially, you do see what are known as co-use crossings, which are basically that, right? They're wildlife crossings that also allow human usage. I would say that that most of the road ecologists I've talked to don't love that concept because animals don't love humans, right? And our presence on a wildlife crossing can certainly deter their usage, which is why I think those there aren't really many proposals out there to build co-use crossings in the U.S. As for the first question, what can we do, to sort of allow our roads to harmonize more with nature? I mean, I would just say, look, one of the big things is just getting rid of a lot of the useless, obsolete, destructive ones that we have, right? One chapter of this book is about the history of the U.S. Forest Service, which, unbeknownst to most people, is the single largest road manager on Earth. You could go to the moon and most of the way back on Forest Service roads, and most of those roads were mid-century logging roads that have long outlived their original purpose, and yet they still have immense impacts. They disrupt habitat security for grizzly bears and lynx and wolverines and all kinds of critters. They're dirt, so they're constantly hemorrhaging sediment into streams and smothering fish eggs and amphibian larvae, right? So they're not, they don't see much traffic, and yet they're kind of preventing our wildest, most biologically important places in this country from really being the great habitat they should be. And so, the Forest Service and lots of other groups are sort of in the process of getting rid of some of these, old, obsolete, destructive roads. Granted, that work again is not funded nearly as well as it should be, and it's not proceeding nearly fast enough. But to me, I mean, I think it illustrates a really important point, which is that roads are not these inevitable permanent features on the landscape. We really can get rid of them in some cases, and we should certainly be doing more of that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great note to end on. Ben, I think you've given us so much to think about. I know that after reading this book, have not been on the road or seen a road in quite the same way. And I think that's really the power of storytelling. And, it's the power of really good, compelling writing. And so I think I speak on behalf of everyone on my staff and everybody who came to this webinar today. Thank you for writing such an eye-opening book, and for giving us something to really think about, a new way to think about our impact on the environments around us.
Thank you so much for saying that, Christy. Thanks again for putting this webinar on, and thanks to everyone out there who tuned in, and thanks to all of you for helping wildlife too. It's a global issue and cause, and I so appreciate everyone who's working hard on behalf of nature.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Be sure to keep an eye out on your email for the next Rare Reads installment, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you again, Ben.